He was but a boy when the truth of his blood first fluttered through hushed whispers in the corridors of Dragonstone. The fortress was no longer a place of grand pageantry. Its ancient walls were haunted by the echoes of a dynasty in twilight, the ghosts of dragons long dead, and the rancor of a continent that had turned against the Targaryen name. Yet inside those halls, a child's destiny began to take shape. No one had anticipated he would be more than a bastard born from the illicit union of unknown parents, hidden by an honorable lord. Few suspected that the wolfish eyes he sometimes revealed, gray as a northern sky, might hide the furnace of a dragon's fury. But Rhaella Targaryen, wearied and haunted by tragedy, saw something the moment the boy was placed in her arms. She saw the faintest flicker of her blood in him. She saw the future, a fragile new branch of House Targaryen, trembling and uncertain yet undeniably alive. It was not meant to be so, of course. The rebellion had ended in Robert Baratheon's ascent to the Iron Throne. The realm believed Prince Rhaegar's 2 children had been dashed to pieces in the Red Keep, while the third, Princess Daenerys, was said to have been born in blood and storm on Dragonstone. Few beyond a trusted circle knew that an infant from a union none had dared imagine still survived. The tales told in the north said that Lord Eddard Stark returned from the Trident with a child who bore none of the features of Catelyn Tully. The realm labeled him Jon Snow, a bastard of House Stark. Yet the truth was far darker and more delicate. He was Rhaegar Targaryen's son, hidden for his own sake. And it was only by the strange benevolence of fate and the cunning loyalty of those who served the fallen prince that the boy was spirited away to his father's family seat. In the chaotic months following the sack of King's Landing, a ship brought him across the Blackwater Bay to Dragonstone, out of the North's sight and the new king's wrath. He was small then, barely old enough to walk without a guiding hand. He remembered little of that treacherous voyage, though in his earliest memories, the thunder of storms over the sea and the sense of cold waves slapping against wooden hulls lingered. At Dragonstone, he found himself among Targaryen loyalists, a scattering of half-starved knights and servants left behind to safeguard the pregnant Rhaella. The queen soon died giving birth to Daenerys, but not before entrusting the well-being of the boy, her grandson, she claimed, to Ser Willem Darry and a handful of retainers. That they accepted the presence of a child who was, according to common talk, dead in the cradle or never born at all, testified to the fierce devotion House Targaryen still inspired in some. To them, he was Aegon Targaryen, the last hope of the rightful royal line. Yet even among those loyalists, caution dominated every choice. They seldom spoke the name Aegon aloud, and though they whispered of prophecy and the promise of dragons reborn, each day at Dragonstone was shadowed by terror that word might reach King's Landing or Storm's End or the Red Keep that a Targaryen heir still lived. In those early years, the boy was called simply Jon, a name chosen by the man who had borne him across the sea from the carnage in King's Landing. He knew no father and no mother. He knew only that the somber, quiet, mustached Ser Willem Darry was a protector, and that another baby, tiny Daenerys, lay in a cradle not far from his own. When the storms raged, Daenerys wailed, while Jon lay awake, wide-eyed, listening to the thunder. He would crawl or toddle over to her cradle, peering in with curiosity that belied any notion of Targaryen arrogance. Her hair was pale and silvery white, her eyes a soft violet. He was dark-haired, with eyes that sometimes seemed as black as a starless night, and other times took on a steely hue that reminded the older knights of the north. Yet day by day, the swirl of rumors in the keep insisted there was something about the tilt of his features, the line of his mouth, that echoed Prince Rhaegar in his youth. One bleak dawn, an aging midwife who had been with Rhaella for both births confided to Ser Willem that the boy had been born a fortnight before the sack, smuggled out of the Red Keep before the Lannister butchery. She insisted there had been a hush in the room, the hush of something monumental. Rhaegar's blood, the midwife said, was strong. It might have slumbered in the child's veins, but it was there, waiting. That was the first time Jon's destiny was voiced aloud in Dragonstone. A child of ice and fire, the living bond between House Stark and House Targaryen, forged in secrecy. As he grew older, no one dared hide the fact that he was different. Perhaps it was the combination of features or the gravity that settled over him too early for an ordinary child. While Daenerys giggled at the way the salt breeze whipped her hair around her face, Jon stood by the windows of Dragonstone's winding corridors, eyes trained on the horizon as if expecting some threat from the sea. The flickering torches in the great hall cast shadows along his cheeks, and in those moments, the knights who had known Rhaegar felt an ache of memory. Something about the boy's quiet intensity, the shape of his stance, reminded them of his father. When he turned his head abruptly, a stray lock of his dark hair slipping over his forehead, they recalled how Rhaegar had stood solemn in the hall at Summerhall as a young boy, reading ancient tomes about prophecy and dragon lore. Yet Jon did not spend his time poring over dusty texts as Rhaegar once did. That was left for the keep's maester, an old man with trembling hands and watery eyes, who sometimes read to both children. There were few books left at Dragonstone. Some had been seized by the crown or had burned in the war. But there was enough for the maester to spin tales of Valyria, Aegon the Conqueror, and the glories of old Targaryen rule. Daenerys listened with wonder, occasionally squealing with delight or fear at the mention of dragons. Jon listened with silence, letting the stories swirl inside him. He was not old enough to understand their significance, but something in those words lit a small flame in him. The notion that he descended from conquerors and kings rattled him as much as it intrigued him, for he could not square such talk with the emptiness he felt in the night, that longing for a mother and father he'd never known. Sometimes, Daenerys would crawl into his bed in the dead of night, seeking warmth. Dragonstone's chambers were damp and cold, and the girl's face would be pink from shivering. Jon would drape an extra blanket over her and wrap his arms around her, the only comfort he could give. He neither complained nor teased. Even as a boy, his heart was gentle. In turn, she looked upon him as a brother, the only family she truly remembered, for neither had truly known Rhaella. Their nurse claimed that just before the queen died, she had stroked Daenerys' cheek and murmured about returning to their rightful throne. But those were only stories. Jon could not imagine a throne or a kingdom beyond the tumultuous sea. He only knew these stony halls. His training began modestly. Ser Willem, his health failing, taught Jon the rudiments of swordplay, using a blunted practice sword that had once belonged to a squire. Jon's hands were small but deft. With each strike, he imagined enemies lurking beyond the thick walls, men who might murder them if they knew his name. Ser Willem was no Jaime Lannister in skill, but he was experienced enough to show the boy how to hold his ground. The old knight took pride in Jon's determination. He remembered how Prince Rhaegar as a youth had shown little interest in arms until some calling or prophecy changed his mind, leading him to train relentlessly. With Jon, there was no prophecy fueling him, at least not so overtly. There was, instead, a quiet fire, a wish to protect Daenerys, to keep her safe from the shadows in the corners of the keep that whispered nightmares of men with gold lions on their breastplates. The keep's servants were a ragged lot, but they loved the children. They were survivors of a toppled dynasty, clinging to what remained of their ancestral loyalty. They mended the children's clothes, prepared the scrawny chickens and fish that could be caught off Dragonstone's rocky coast, and told them stories of the free cities and of Viserys, the exiled prince who had fled across the narrow sea before their arrival. But the children were kept in the dark about much of what had happened. Robert Baratheon wore the crown, the Targaryens were considered usurped, and none knew precisely how the Game of Thrones would shift in the years to come. Jon was 6 when he found himself standing in the castle's library, rummaging through a battered chest of relics that had survived the flight from King's Landing. Within lay a cloth-wrapped bundle, and when he pulled it free, dust tickled his nose, making him sneeze. Inside, he discovered a small silver dragon pendant, its wings outstretched as though in mid-flight. He held it up to the torchlight and felt a stirring deep inside. The gemstone set in its eye glimmered red, like a coal on the verge of dimming. The pendant was too large for his small throat, so he curled his fingers around it and wondered if it had once belonged to Rhaegar or another Targaryen prince. He took it to Ser Willem, who said nothing at first. Then the old knight exhaled a heavy sigh and told him it had belonged to Princess Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife, for whom the dragon pendant had been a symbol of her marriage into House Targaryen. The knowledge chilled Jon. He did not yet comprehend the complex tangles of lineage that made him the union of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark, not Elia Martell. But something about that pendant suggested a world of tragedy that had preceded him, a realm of heartbreak he had inherited. In time, Jon discovered his capacity for leadership in small ways. One day, the scrawny stable boy refused to fetch hay because the master-at-arms had struck him for being slow. Daenerys, unafraid, urged the stable boy to stand his ground. When the stable boy refused, tears brimming in his eyes, Jon approached the master-at-arms, calmly requesting leniency. There was no reason for cruelty, he argued. Something in Jon's voice commanded attention. Even though he was but a slip of a boy, the master-at-arms, a sour man who had survived 3 kings, sneered at first. But Jon did not flinch. He stared at the man, gray eyes steady as if summoning a hidden authority. In the hush that followed, the stable boy hastily retrieved the hay, but the master-at-arms did not strike him again. Jon had won a victory, small though it was, and Daenerys' eyes glowed with admiration. That evening, she asked him if they would ever leave Dragonstone, if they would sail away to a glorious kingdom across the sea, or return to King's Landing to claim what was theirs. Jon, looking at the flickering candle, whispered that he did not know. Something told him that returning to King's Landing might be as dangerous as walking into a dragon's lair. Time was a slow, grinding wheel on Dragonstone, measured by the changing tide, the intensifying storms, and the ceaseless wind that howled through the fortress's black stone towers. Jon was 9 when Ser Willem Darry succumbed to a cough that turned his breathing ragged and stained his kerchief red with blood. On his deathbed, the old knight beckoned Jon closer. He lifted a trembling hand to cup the boy's cheek, tears in his eyes. "You have your father's spirit," he rasped, "but your mother's strength, too. Never doubt that." Jon frowned, uncertain what it meant, for he had been told little of his mother beyond that she was some great lady. Before he could ask more, Ser Willem's eyes drifted shut, and the keep lost one of the last men who had known Rhaegar Targaryen personally. Daenerys wept openly at Ser Willem's passing, clinging to Jon as if he were the last pillar keeping her steady. Jon tried to be strong for her. He tried not to cry, but in the privacy of his small chamber, tears did escape him. With the old knight gone, their link to the older generation of Targaryen loyalists frayed even more. The household at Dragonstone shrank, both in spirit and number. Some whispered that the time had come for the children to leave, to flee across the narrow sea to Pentos or Bravos, where Viserys was rumored to be living under a benefactor's roof. Others insisted that the boy's northern features might doom them if the secret of his parentage were discovered. He looked part Stark, after all, but that the best hiding place was perhaps right under the nose of the Baratheon king, for who would suspect a Targaryen to remain at Dragonstone? In the end, inertia held them. They stayed because they had nowhere else to go. The usurper's men seldom visited the bleak isle, and it was rumored that the new king found it a dreary place he'd gladly ignore. When Jon was 10, Maester Taryn, old and feeble, decided the boy needed a more structured education. He taught Jon and Daenerys the lineages of the great houses, the histories of the 7 kingdoms, and even some high Valyrian phrases. Dany struggled with the genealogies but found the Valyrian words elegant, echoing faintly in her Targaryen blood. Jon took to the lineage of the North with uncanny intuition. Names like Brandon the Builder, Torrhen Stark, and other figures long shrouded in the mists of time lit an ember in his heart. He could picture the great dire wolf of House Stark. But something else resonated too when he learned of House Targaryen's line, the conquests, the forging of the Iron Throne, the hatching of dragons. At night, he would sometimes dream of a wolf with burning red eyes standing beside a monstrous dragon, flames dancing in the reflected glow of the beast's scales. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering, uncertain of what the dream meant. He was not told outright that Rhaegar Targaryen was his father until his 11th name day. By then, he had gleaned enough from overheard whispers and the old letters Maester Taryn guarded that he suspected something of the sort. Yet to hear it confirmed was to feel the very stones beneath his feet shift. He was given no illusions about how dangerous this knowledge was. They told him that if Robert Baratheon discovered his existence, he would likely send men to kill him and Daenerys both. The realm had no love left for Targaryens, no matter how innocent they might be. But there was more to it than that. In hushed voices, they told him that his mother was Lyanna Stark, sister to Eddard Stark, Warden of the North. That revelation jarred him even more deeply. He had spent his life hearing that the Starks were Robert Baratheon's staunch allies, that they had warred against the Targaryens. Yet he himself was both Stark and Targaryen. This knowledge bound him to two worlds, two families, two legacies that had clashed in bloody conflict. And he was asked to keep it secret, to hide it even from Daenerys until the time was right. Jon did not speak for days after learning the truth. He felt as though a storm raged within him, like the storms that battered Dragonstone's basalt walls. Daenerys tried to coax him to speak. She offered to braid his hair in the Valyrian style if he told her what troubled him. At last, gazing into her lilac eyes, Jon realized she had a right to know something of their heritage as well. He did not divulge the name Stark, but he told her that both of them carried royal blood, that their father had been a prince renowned for his honor and his harp, and that the world beyond Dragonstone had cast them out. He spoke in a strained whisper of how alone they were, how precarious their position. Daenerys took his hands, an uncharacteristic gravity in her face, and promised him that whatever they faced it together. In the months that followed, Jon's training with the sword intensified. Maester Taryn sought out a few sellswords in the port who might instruct him in exchange for gold or silver plate from the keep's dwindling stores. Jon learned quickly, his instincts sharpened by the sense that his life might one day depend on these skills. He was neither the largest nor the strongest of boys, but he was quick, and his endurance was fueled by a quiet resolve. The sellswords, men who had fought in Essos, the Stepstones, and beyond, taught him different fighting styles, from Braavosi water dancing to the brute force typical of Westerosi knights. Jon was no prodigy, but he worked tirelessly. The calluses on his palms thickened, and bruises speckled his arms and legs. A few times, Daenerys would sneak into the yard to watch him spar, her hair braided back, eyes wide. Sometimes she teased him that she would be riding dragons one day while he swung his little sword. Other times, she simply looked at him with admiration and something like awe. The years passed, and the keep's limited resources dwindled. Fish became the staple of every meal. The handful of loyal Targaryen knights aged or left, seeking fortunes abroad. By the time Jon was 14, it was only him, Daenerys, Maester Taryn, a few household servants, and a single knight, Ser Joffrey Celtigar, a man of distant Targaryen loyalty who remained to defend Dragonstone. The weight of survival pressed heavily on them. Some nights, Jon would climb the winding steps to the top of the stone drum tower and look out across the Black Sea. He imagined the north, a land of snows and wolves, harsh but steadfast. He wondered what manner of man Eddard Stark was. He wondered if there were cousins who looked like him. Then he would glance down at the courtyard where Daenerys walked, silver hair shining in the moonlight, and he would remember that he was Targaryen as well. The sea wind tousled his dark hair, and he felt torn between two destinies, neither fully in his grasp. It was that same year that a small boat arrived under cover of darkness, carrying a one-eyed man who claimed to bear a message from Illyrio Mopatis of Pentos. Apparently, Viserys Targaryen had made contact with Illyrio, seeking to gather the scattered remnants of House Targaryen's supporters. The one-eyed messenger brought a letter that invited Jon and Daenerys to Pentos, where Viserys planned to arrange an alliance that might help restore their house to the Iron Throne. The messenger did not know of Jon's secret parentage. He believed Daenerys and Viserys were siblings, and that Jon was a distant cousin or a ward. Maester Taryn received the messenger with caution, feeding him carefully gleaned fish and watery ale, then sent him away with a diplomatic response that they would consider it. After the man left, Taryn gathered Jon and Daenerys to discuss their future. Daenerys was eager to leave Dragonstone's cold halls. She had grown into a slender young woman with a regal bearing that belied her humble upbringing, and her curiosity about the world beyond these shores was unquenchable. She longed to see the fabled free cities, to watch the markets where Myrish tapestries hung in bright colors, to taste spiced wine under the sun of Pentos. Jon, too, felt the draw of the wider world, but he was uneasy. Something in Illyrio's message struck him as opportunistic. The wealthy magister had a reputation for manipulations and hidden bargains. And there was Viserys, a brother neither he nor Daenerys had seen since they were infants. Sked Maester Taryn pointedly. What if our best hope is not in crowns and swords, but in living quietly? Could we not sail across the sea, change our names, and live in peace? Daenerys gazed at him in disbelief. Peace, she said. We have no peace here, nor would we find it by cowering in shadows. Our family was once great. We can be great again. The passion in her voice startled Jon. He realized how differently they had come to view their predicament. For him, it was a burden to be carried. For her, it was a birthright to be reclaimed. In the end, the decision was deferred. Another year slipped by. Jon honed his skills with the sword, and Daenerys practiced her Valyrian, along with the mannerisms of a lady who might attend a noble court. Taryn worried that if Robert Baratheon passed away, the realm might tumble into chaos, giving them an opportunity. Alternatively, if the king discovered them beforehand, it would mean swift doom. Jon felt the pressure mounting, as though he walked a narrow path flanked by abyss on both sides. Winter came, but it was a mild one in the south. The storms battered Dragonstone as ever, though. One especially violent storm crashed against the fortress walls, sending waves high enough to drench the courtyard. Water seeped into the lower chambers, forcing servants to scramble to keep precious supplies dry. During the storm's fury, Daenerys found Jon in the library, pacing restlessly. "You're brooding again," she teased, though her tone was gentle. "What is it this time?" He halted, raking a hand through his dark hair. "I was thinking of my mother." The words spilled out quietly. "I don't even know what she looked like. I've heard only whispers. She was said to be beautiful with a fierce heart. The wolf maid of the north." Daenerys studied his face, sympathy welling up. "There are portraits in the keep of your father's line," she said softly, "but none of your mother's." She reached out, laying a hand on his arm. "Maybe one day you'll see your mother's kin." He nodded, though he remained uncertain. If the Starks learned of him, would they not hate him for what had happened during the rebellion? For the swirl of events that led to the deaths of Brandon and Rickard Stark? For the Targaryen name that had spelled ruin for so many? He kept these doubts to himself. That night, unable to sleep, Jon wandered the corridors lit by flickering torches. He paused near Daenerys's room, hearing her murmur in her sleep. He recalled how she used to cry as a babe in the storms. Now she scarcely flinched when thunder boomed. She had grown strong and in some ways regal. He wondered if that was the Targaryen arrogance taking root, or simply the blossoming of a girl becoming a woman with a determined heart. He continued on and ended up in the crypt-like recesses of the castle's underbelly, where a handful of dragon skulls still lingered, remnants of the once great Targaryen power. They were small compared to the massive skulls that had decorated the Red Keep, but they were dragons all the same, with hollow eyes and gaping maws filled with curved teeth. In the glow of the torch, they seemed almost alive. He stood before them, heart pounding. There was a stirring in his blood, an inexplicable pull. He reached out a hand and touched the ridged brow of one skull. The bone was cold and smooth beneath his fingertips. A swirl of memory that was not his own flickered in his mind. The roar of dragons, the heat of flame, the shadow of wings across a burning sky. He staggered back, breath coming fast. For a moment, he thought he saw a ghost of a dragon's presence. Then the torch guttered and it was gone. The next morning, he confided in Daenerys what he had felt. She listened with bright-eyed wonder, then suggested that maybe they were meant to wake the dragons, that their blood carried that legacy. "You're as much a Targaryen as I am," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "The dragons might answer to us if we can find them." He sensed her fervor, her belief in ancient prophecies of House Targaryen. He did not share the same certainty. He recalled half-forgotten words that Maester Taryn had muttered. "The dragon has 3 heads. He did not know the meaning behind that phrase, though he guessed it had something to do with Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, who had forged the Seven Kingdoms together. Was Daenerys imagining that she and Jon would be two heads of a new dragon triumvirate, the third being Viserys? Or did it imply something else entirely? At 15, Jon had become tall and lean, with well-defined muscles earned through tireless practice. A few of the older servants would remark that he moved with the grace and guarded expression of Prince Rhaegar. His hair was still dark as midnight, though in strong sunlight it bore faint glints of Targaryen silver, or so the more wistful among them claimed. Daenerys was a year younger, slender and elegant, with hair of molten silver gold. Her face was delicate, her bearing graceful, and her mind sharp. Together, they wandered Dragonstone's ramparts, discussing the future. Daenerys spoke of reclaiming the Iron Throne, forging alliances with powerful lords, perhaps even marrying into a great house to secure loyalty. Jon listened, torn. If he were indeed the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, that made him a claimant as well. Yet the idea of fighting a bloody war to seat himself or Daenerys on the Iron Throne filled him with dread. He had never seen King's Landing. He had never heard the small folk cry out for a Targaryen restoration. He had only heard of the bitterness, the heartbreak, the wars. One morning, with the tide out, Jon decided to explore a rocky section of the shoreline beneath Dragonstone's cliffs. He made his way carefully over slick stones, gulls screeching overhead, until he came to a small cave mouth partially hidden by seaweed. Inside, the air was cold and damp. A trickle of salt water seeped along the floor. He used a torch to light his way. The cave was not large, but in one corner, the briny water pooled, reflecting strange shapes along the walls. He touched the stones, feeling their roughness, noticing the faint grooves that might have been scratches from some large creature centuries past, or simply the result of tidal erosion. Still, he felt a peculiar hush there, as though the ghosts of dragons lingered even in the caves beneath Dragonstone. He stayed until the tide shifted, the water surging in. He had to scramble out, drenched to the thigh. But for the rest of that day, he felt oddly at peace, as though something in that watery gloom had whispered reassurance to him. News from beyond the island was sparse but occasionally arrived via merchant vessels. Whispers reached them that Robert Baratheon was secure on the throne, that Eddard Stark was Warden of the North, that tensions flared here or there but no open rebellions threatened the crown. The names of the Lannisters came up often, though Tywin, the formidable lord of Casterly Rock, and his children, one of whom was the Queen. Jon listened carefully, piecing together a picture of a realm he had never known. He wondered if, in the far north, Eddard Stark was content with the new order, or if some hidden sorrow for his lost sister still haunted him. Did he ever suspect that Jon lived, half Targaryen, hidden away? If he did, he sent no raven to that effect. Then came the day when Daenerys turned 14. She wore a makeshift gown that the household servants had sewn together from old silks, dyed a pale lilac to match her eyes. Jon gifted her the dragon pendant he had once found in the chest, which shone silver against her pale neck. She smiled radiantly, tears in her eyes, and they shared a brief moment of closeness, two children grown into near adults, clinging to each other in a world that cared nothing for their lineage. That evening, a small feast was prepared in the great hall, with fish stew and fresh bread. Daenerys danced around the table, laughing. Jon watched her, silently marveling at her transformation from the little girl who used to cling to him during storms. But as the night wore on, and the candles burned low, talk turned to the question of Pentos again. Ser Joffrey Celtigar insisted it was time for the Targaryens to reunite. Viserys needed Daenerys' presence for any alliance he might form. Daenerys grew thoughtful, no longer a laughing girl. "If my brother calls, I should answer," she said. "It is our house, our birthright." Jon felt a stab of unease. He had not forgotten the rumors of Viserys' temper, his obsession with retaking Westeros by force. Yet Daenerys seemed resolute. "Will you come with me?" she asked, turning to Jon. "We've stood by each other all our lives. I cannot leave you here." Jon hesitated. In truth, he did not want to be parted from her. She was the only family he had ever truly known, the only link to his father's lineage that he could trust. But to go to Pentos might be to step into the spider's web of political intrigue, to risk Robert Baratheon's assassins or whatever manipulations Illyrio Mopatis had in mind. And what if, in Pentos, Viserys discovered that Jon was not just any bastard ward, but another Targaryen heir, one who might overshadow him if the truth ever came to light? The potential for conflict was immense. Yet how could he remain alone on Dragonstone? The fortress was dying around him, a husk of a once great seat. He had to decide, and in his heart, he knew he could not abandon Daenerys. So it was settled. Within a fortnight, they prepared a ship to sail for Pentos. The handful of servants who remained would watch over Dragonstone in their absence. The parting was bittersweet. Maester Taryn, too old to travel, embraced them both, tears leaking from his faded eyes. Ser Joffrey pledged his sword to Daenerys, vowing to protect her with his life. The ship set off under a gray sky, the sea wind cold and biting. Daenerys huddled in a cloak of black velvet, the dragon pendant glinting at her throat. Jon stood beside her on the deck, watching as Dragonstone's dark silhouette receded into the distance. He felt a pang of loss, but also an undercurrent of excitement. Here, at last, was a new chapter of their lives. The voyage took several days. Daenerys was queasy at times, but Jon, who had grown up amid storms, fared better. He spent hours on the deck, scanning the horizon. The motion of the ship lulled him into introspection. In his mind, he revisited all he had learned of his parents. Rhaegar Targaryen, noble and doomed, a prince who believed in prophecy and died on the Trident. Lyanna Stark, the wolf maid who had been spirited away, whose death had sparked a rebellion. Could their union have been founded on love, or was it all part of some grand design? The questions gnawed at him. He wondered if the Seven watched him still, or if the old gods of the north whispered in the rustle of the sea breeze. When Pentos finally rose on the horizon, it dazzled with its white walls and domes shimmering in the midday sun. The harbor teemed with ships from across the narrow sea, sails of every color fluttering in the breeze. As they docked, the aromas of exotic spices and roasting meats drifted to them, and the babble of foreign tongues filled the air. Daenerys' eyes shone with wonder. Jon felt a surge of cautious curiosity. They had stepped into a world far removed from the lonely halls of Dragonstone. Illyrio Mopatis awaited them in a grand manse on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling estate with marble floors and lush gardens. He greeted them with lavish courtesy, bowing low to Daenerys and smiling at Jon. The Magister was a large man, richly dressed, with rings glittering on every finger and a carefully curated beard that framed his calculating smile. He led them through the courtyard where fountains trickled and peacocks strutted. Slaves bowed as they passed. Daenerys stiffened, discomfited by the open presence of slaves. This was her first time in Essos, and the reality of it startled her. Jon felt an instinctive twinge of unease. He recalled that House Targaryen had historically dealt in different ways with slavery, yet they were Valyrian in origin, a people who had once dominated much of Essos. He sensed the moral complications swirling beneath the surface but had no time to dwell on them. In the grand hall, cooled by breezes wafting through arched windows, they found Viserys Targaryen. He stood by a table laden with fruits and wines, dressed in finery that seemed worn at the edges, as though he had maintained his wardrobe past its prime. He was slight of build, his silver-gold hair trailing down to his shoulders, and his eyes carried a feverish light. The moment he saw Daenerys, he let out a breathless laugh of delight, rushing forward to clasp her hands. For a moment, it seemed genuine brotherly affection flickered in his gaze. Then he saw Jon. He arched an eyebrow, his expression cool. "So this is the ward," he said. "I've heard rumors that you are a decent swordsman." Jon inclined his head. "I do my best," he said, careful to keep his tone polite. He could almost feel Viserys' suspicion. Daenerys attempted to introduce them more warmly, but Viserys soon monopolized her attention, speaking of plans, alliances, and a rumored marriage proposal from a Dothraki call. At the mention of marrying a Dothraki horse lord, Daenerys blanched, looking at Jon with alarm. Viserys pressed on, expounding the necessity of forging a powerful alliance that might supply an army to retake the Iron Throne. Jon, listening in the background, felt a chill. It was the first time he confronted the stark reality. The Targaryen restoration that Viserys dreamed of was not a romantic notion of rightful succession. It was war, blood and fire unleashed upon Westeros. Jon pictured the small folk caught in the crossfire, the villages burned. He imagined the lords who had fought the Targaryens once, and would do so again. Where would that leave him, torn between Stark and Targaryen? Over the weeks that followed in Pentos, Illyrio hosted extravagant feasts. Daenerys was paraded before foreign dignitaries and wealthy merchants. Her beauty and heritage whispered about with reverence. Viserys spoke loudly of his claim, of the day he would cross the sea with a horde of Dothraki screamers at his back. He seldom acknowledged Jon, except to sneer or issue veiled barbs about the bastard ward who's grown too big for his britches. Daenerys tried to mend the rift between them, but Viserys was dismissive. Jon noticed how her eyes dimmed when her brother brushed her aside or grew irritated if she questioned his decisions. The Targaryen siblings had been separated since infancy, and their bond was tenuous. Jon, despite all his reservations, found himself becoming a confidant for Daenerys's doubts. She would steal away from the feasts or from Viserys' tirades to find Jon. They would walk the estate's gardens, the moonlight casting silver patterns across the marble paths, and she would share her fears. "I don't want to marry a Khal I've never met," she whispered one night, tears trembling in her eyes. "But Viserys says it's necessary. He says we must have an army, or we'll never see Westeros again." Jon felt a surge of protectiveness, remembering the small girl who used to cling to him during storms. "It should be your choice," he said quietly, though he knew the realities of royal alliances seldom cared about personal choice. Her helpless expression tore at him, and he found himself hating Viserys for putting her in such a predicament. Yet was it so different from any arranged match a noble lady might face in Westeros? Did not the lords marry off their daughters for alliances all the time? Illyrio Mopatis arranged a meeting with Khal Drogo, a legendary Dothraki warlord who commanded tens of thousands of warriors. Viserys insisted Daenerys attend, swathed in the finest silks. The Khal was a towering figure, his long braid heavy with bells that jingled softly as he moved. His eyes appraised Daenerys, lingering on her silver-gold hair, her slender frame, and her regal bearing. Jon stood off to the side, heart pounding with an unfamiliar mixture of apprehension and aggression. He itched to intervene whenever Drogo's dark gaze settled too long on Daenerys, but he forced himself to remain still. Viserys seemed oblivious to the tension, too fixated on impressing the Khal with talk of the Conqueror's blood and the glorious future when they would ride into Westeros and claim the Iron Throne. Khal Drogo, for his part, was stoic, speaking little. Yet the arrangement was swiftly concluded. Drogo would wed Daenerys, and in return, he would promise to help place Viserys on the throne, once certain conditions were met. That night, Daenerys sobbed on her bed, the dragon pendant clenched in her fists. Jon knelt by her side, gently coaxing her to breathe, to steady herself. She pressed her face to his shoulder, tears hot against his skin. "I don't want this," she gasped. "I don't know the Dothraki. I don't speak their language. I'm afraid." Jon held her, stroking her hair. Deep inside, an anger smoldered. This arrangement might gain them an army, but at what cost to Daenerys' happiness and safety? He could see no easy path. If Daenerys refused, Viserys' wrath would be terrible, and Illyrio might withdraw his support. If she accepted, she risked being a stranger in a strange land, bound to a man of fearsome reputation. In the days leading to the wedding, Jon argued in private with Viserys for the first time. He insisted Daenerys was too young, that she should have a say. Viserys spat back that she was the blood of the dragon, that her wants mattered little compared to the destiny of their house. Jon retorted that if she was truly of the blood of the dragon, forcing her hand would only sow resentment. Viserys' pale eyes flashed with fury. He demanded to know why Jon presumed to speak for Daenerys as if he were some rightful guardian. "You are nothing but a wolf-blooded bastard," he sneered. "Your place is to serve, not to question. Remember that." The words stung. Jon felt the old conflict in his veins. Stark versus Targaryen, a dual heritage that gave Viserys ammunition to belittle him. He stormed out, his fists clenched, heading to the training yard where he battered a straw dummy until his knuckles ached. The wedding took place outside Pentos, in a grassy field where Dothraki assembled in splendor. Hundreds of horses galloped in displays of skill, men wrestling and brandishing rocks, women dancing to the pounding beat of drums. Daenerys stood in silks that glimmered pale lavender, her hair styled in intricate braids. Her face was composed, but Jon saw the trembling of her hands. Khal Drogo, draped in the vestiges of Dothraki chieftain status, approached her. The ceremony was quick by Dothraki standards. A few solemn words, a traditional feast, and then the newlywed couple rode away to consummate their union. Viserys seemed euphoric, convinced that his path to the Iron Throne was finally guaranteed. Illyrio beamed, no doubt pleased with the alliances he had forged. Jon was left with a sense of dread. He consoled himself that at least, from the little he observed, Khal Drogo was neither cruel nor indifferent. He was stoic and fearsome, but there was power in the way he treated Daenerys with a certain unexpected softness. Jon prayed to the gods, whichever might listen, that Daenerys would find some measure of peace. In the weeks that followed, Daenerys became the Khaleesi of Khal Drogo's vast khalasar, traveling with them across the Sea of Grass. Viserys, irritated that Drogo had not immediately begun sailing for Westeros, hovered like a vulture. Jon, caught between wanting to protect Dany and having no rightful place in the khalasar, spent restless nights in Pentos, uncertain of his role. By day he trained, studied the ways of Essos, and brooded. Illyrio occasionally invited him to lavish suppers, plying him with spiced wines and subtle questions about his loyalty. Jon answered carefully. He revealed little, though he suspected Illyrio guessed that Jon was not merely a distant cousin. The Magister's cunning eyes glinted whenever Jon mentioned "my father" in the abstract. At last, Jon could bear the distance no longer. He saddled a horse and accompanied a small retinue of Illyrio's men to visit the khalasar, which had set up camp near a river. He found Daenerys seated on a cushion under a canopy, her once slender form now showing subtle signs of pregnancy. The sight filled Jon with a swirl of emotions. She rose, radiant, and embraced him warmly. For a moment, they were back in Dragonstone's halls, children clinging to each other. But the khalasar bustled around them, armed Dothraki warriors watching Jon with suspicion. Khal Drogo himself appeared, towering in his leather vest, braids swaying. He greeted Jon with a nod, respectful enough since Jon was a guest. Through halting words in Dothraki, Dany had taught him a few phrases. Jon expressed gratitude for the Khal's hospitality. Later, Daenerys confided that she had come to an uneasy peace with her situation. Drogo was a man of few words, but she sensed a certain tenderness beneath his fierce exterior. She believed he genuinely cared for her, and once their son was born, he might be willing to cross the narrow sea to fulfill Viserys' ambition, though for Daenerys, it was no longer about Viserys alone. She dreamt of a world where her child could have a rightful claim, a safer home than these endless grass plains. She spoke of the stallion that mounts the world, a prophecy whispered by the Dothraki crones. Jon listened, feeling both relief at her happiness and concern for the future. He could see how Viserys' impatience festered in the background like a wound. Indeed, that impatience soon became a boil that burst. Viserys, lashing out in a moment of drunken rage, confronted Daenerys in the khalasar's midst. He threatened her, ignoring Drogo's warriors bristling around them. Jon was not present for the confrontation, but he arrived in time to hear rumors of what followed, that Khal Drogo had poured molten gold over Viserys' head, naming him no true dragon. Daenerys watched her brother die without a tear, or so the whispers claimed. She was left the last known Targaryen of her line, except for Jon, though no one spoke of that openly. When Jon heard the details, horror mingled with a grim sense of inevitability. Viserys had always treated Dany as a tool, had threatened her, had belittled him. The man's downfall was inescapable once he offended the call beyond all tolerance. Jon traveled again to see Daenerys, worried about her state of mind. He found her in a private tent, eyes rimmed with fatigue. She looked at him with sorrow but also with a new hardness. "He was my brother," she said softly. "Yet he frightened me more than Drogo ever did. And now he's gone." Jon could think of no comforting words. He merely knelt beside her, took her hand, and told her she was not alone. She squeezed his hand. "Khal Drogo has promised to conquer Westeros for our son," she murmured. "I don't know if that's what I truly want, but perhaps it is the only way to secure a future for my child. A dragon cannot hide forever." Jon's heart clenched at those words, as if they were meant for him too. He wondered if his own destiny lay in hiding or in stepping forward to claim a birthright he had never asked for. He found himself staying with the Khalasar for a time, living among the Dothraki. They eyed him warily, but Daenerys assured them he was her bloodkin, a man of the dragon. He tried to learn their ways, observing how they tamed horses, how they prized strength, how honor was measured by might. Drogo tolerated his presence, for Daenerys clearly valued him. But the warlord's approach to Westeros was vague. He would invade, so he said, when the omens were right and when his son was born. Then tragedy struck as Daenerys entered labor prematurely. The Khalasar was on the move, and a violent skirmish with another Khalasar left Drogo gravely wounded. Desperate to save him, Daenerys allowed a Magi, a witch named Mirri Maz Duur, to use blood magic. Jon witnessed the ritual with alarm. Shadows danced in the lamplight, and Drogo's tent filled with unnatural whispers that seemed to crawl along Jon's skin. In the end, Drogo survived but was left catatonic, a breathing corpse. Daenerys lost her child, the son she had believed would be the stallion that mounts the world. Jon watched Daenerys weep bitterly over the lifeless form, her spirit all but crushed. The Khalasar began to fracture, losing faith in a Khal who could no longer lead. In the aftermath, Mirri Maz Duur claimed it was Daenerys' child who paid the price for the forbidden magic. The realization broke something in Dany, but it also awakened a fierce resolve. She smothered Drogo's empty shell one night, whispering goodbye, then prepared a funeral pyre for him. Jon stood by her side. In a move that stunned the onlookers, Daenerys tied the Magi to the pyre, vowing that only life could pay for death. Jon felt revulsion twist in his gut, but he could not deny the sense of ancient power swirling. Daenerys stepped into the flames as they roared, drawing gasps and cries from the Dothraki. Jon lunged forward, but a wave of heat forced him back, scorching his arms. He called her name, horror-stricken. The fire raged through the night. When the dawn came, Daenerys was revealed alive at the center of the ashes, unburnt, and 3 small dragons clinging to her, newly hatched from petrified eggs. Jon stared in awe, his breath stolen by the sight of living dragons, believed extinct for over a century. The world seemed to shift on its axis, everything he knew overshadowed by this miraculous event. Daenerys stood bare and smudged with ash, the dragons squeaking at her heels. The Dothraki knelt, proclaiming her the mother of dragons. Jon, trembling, approached her with his cloak and draped it around her shoulders. She turned to him, eyes reflecting the dawn's light with a fiery gleam. He felt the heat emanating from her skin, as if she carried the fire of old Valyria within her. "They live," he whispered, awe choking his voice. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "The blood of the dragon," she said quietly. "It woke them." And then she looked at Jon, her gaze piercing, as if she saw him anew. "We are not alone anymore." From that moment, Daenerys became something more than a displaced princess. She was Khaleesi to a small band of followers who remained, and she was mother to dragons, creatures that bent the laws of life and death. Jon felt an almost spiritual fear and wonder when he looked at them, remembering the skulls under Dragonstone, the echoes of Rhaegar's dream, and the half-whispered prophecy that had hovered over his life. If Dany could awaken dragons from stone, what might his own destiny hold? Might the magic of ice and fire be stirring in his blood as well? Daenerys named the dragons Drogon, Regal, and Viserion. Drogon was black and red, the largest and fiercest, seemingly embodying Drogo's spirit. Regal bore green and bronze scales, a tribute to Prince Rhaegar, and Viserion shimmered in cream and gold. She spent hours each day tending to them, forging a bond that transcended words. Jon watched with admiration and a tinge of envy. He felt connected to them in some small way, especially Regal, whose name honored Jon's father. Yet they flocked to Daenerys first, nestling against her warmth. Word of the miracle spread quickly. Dothraki outliers, curious or in awe, drifted back to witness the living dragons. Some pledged themselves to Daenerys. Others feared black magic and fled. Across the sea in Pentos, Illyrio Mopatis and others with cunning minds began to send envoys, offers of alliance, pleas for a glimpse of the dragons. Westeros, too, would eventually hear the rumors. A Targaryen girl with dragons reborn. The realm might laugh it off as nonsense, or it might take it as a sign of grave danger. Jon wondered how Robert Baratheon would react to whispers of living dragons. He suspected the king's response would be swift and ruthless, if he believed it. But Daenerys had changed. Losing her child and her husband had hardened her. Then the birth of the dragons had transformed her into a figure of prophecy and awe. She spoke of crossing to Westeros, not merely to claim her birthright, but to break the wheel of tyranny and bring freedom to the common folk. Jon listened, both drawn to her vision and fearful of the war it would entail. The Dothraki, savage in their ways, might pillage and destroy. Yet Dany insisted she would forge a new path, that she would not be a tyrant. The question of how to feed an army, how to cross the sea, and how to face the might of the Seven Kingdoms remained unanswered. Jon found himself at her side often, aiding her in small ways, organizing the meager supplies, helping the old and wounded, training the men who would become her personal guard. The Dothraki who accepted him called him the Pale Wolf, half in jest. Yet they respected his skill with a sword. Daenerys, for her part, consulted him on matters she might once have left to Viserys. She asked his counsel about dealing with the other Dothraki clans, about approaching the free cities for support. He gave his opinions humbly, trying to balance caution with boldness. He saw that she trusted him as she trusted no other. At times, in the hush of night, she would confide in him that she still grieved for her child, that she felt the weight of an entire house on her shoulders. She would rest her head on his shoulder, as she once did in childhood storms, and he would whisper whatever comfort he could. It was in one of these moments, under a sky full of stars, the three dragons sleeping nearby, that Daenerys asked him about his mother. Perhaps it was the rawness of her own loss, perhaps it was the closeness of their bond. He hesitated, then confessed part of the truth, that she was Lyanna Stark, Ned Stark's sister, and that he carried the blood of House Stark as well as House Targaryen. Daenerys absorbed this revelation in silence, her eyes wide with shock. Then she breathed, ice and fire, echoing the old prophecy she had heard whispered by some who still remembered Rhaegar's obsessions. You are the child of ice and fire, Jon. You have as much claim to the Iron Throne as I do. A taut silence followed. Jon's heart hammered. He had just revealed a secret that could change everything. Daenerys looked at him with a complicated swirl of emotions. Wonder, kinship, perhaps a hint of jealousy, and also a deep sense of connection. Does that mean you intend to take the throne for yourself? She asked quietly. Jon shook his head. I don't even know what I want, he admitted. All my life, I've been hidden, told my parentage was a death sentence if discovered. I've never craved power or crowns. He faltered, unsure of how to articulate the yearning he felt for a place where he could belong, where he could do good without the shadow of war looming. Daenerys gently placed a hand on his cheek. We'll figure it out together, she promised. The dragons have returned, Jon. Perhaps we are meant to restore what was lost, but in a better way than before. In that moment, She pulled him into an embrace, and he closed his eyes, holding her. They stood among the grass and the slumbering dragons, two Targaryen heirs bound by secrets, by tragedies, and by hope. In the days that followed, Daenerys insisted that Jon's identity remain concealed. The Dothraki would not care, but across the sea, assassins would come for them both if Robert learned the truth. Some of her closest advisors, a blood rider and a couple of freed slaves, began to notice Jon's close bond with Dany and asked questions. She deflected them, explaining that he was her most trusted ally, with some Targaryen blood by a distant line, enough to earn him the name Blood of the Dragon. Jon noticed how her leadership style was evolving. She listened to her people's concerns, sought ways to break from the Dothraki tradition of pillaging. It was not easy. Many in the Khalasar grumbled, but her personal strength and the presence of the dragons commanded respect. Eventually, the time came to move on. The Khalasar traveled east, away from the coastal regions near Pentos, for Daenerys wished to learn more of the lands beyond the Red Waste, perhaps to visit Qarth where wealthy merchants might be persuaded to invest in her cause. She invited Jon to accompany her. He did not hesitate. He had no desire to remain in Pentos under Illyrio's manipulative gaze. Together they rode with the Dothraki, forging a path across scorched plains and through towering mountains. The journey was arduous, testing the limits of human endurance. Hunger and thirst stalked them. Daenerys's dragons grew each day, small though they still were, hunting lizards and small animals under the watchful eyes of the Khalasar. One blistering afternoon, Jon rode beside Daenerys at the head of the column, scanning the horizon. Sand and rocks stretched into the distance, shimmering in the heat. He wiped sweat from his brow, longing for the cool breezes of Dragonstone. Daenerys's face was resolute, her silver hair tied back, strands clinging to her damp neck. She spoke little, conserving energy in the stifling conditions. Yet Jon sensed her determination had never been stronger. They pressed on, day after day, forging an unbreakable bond among those who endured the hardships with her. At long last, they reached the outskirts of the Red Waste. Survivors of another Khalasar told them of a city beyond the desert, a place of splendor where the Mother of Dragons might find welcome or betrayal. Daenerys resolved to press forward. She consulted Jon in the cool of night, dragons curled around them like living embers. "If we succeed," she murmured, "we might gain the resources to finally cross the sea and claim Westeros." Her eyes shone with a mingling of resolve and apprehension. Jon thought of the land of his mother's people, the winter snows he had never seen, the possibility of reuniting with the North. He thought of the Iron Throne and the battles that would inevitably come. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together." She nodded, placing a hand on his, the flickering firelight dancing across their faces. They continued onward, the desert dust caking their clothes, scorpions and snakes posing constant threats. Water was precious. Some of the weaker travelers fell behind, succumbing to heat. Through it all, Daenerys led with compassion and resolve. Jon helped hunt, organized the watchers at night, and consoled the grieving. The dragons soared overhead, leaving fleeting shadows across the burning sands. Their presence lent a kind of mythic aura to the march, as if they were enacting a prophecy older than any of them. At the journey's darkest moment, when the last waterskins were nearly empty, they stumbled upon an oasis, a hidden spring surrounded by scraggly palms. Relief washed over the Khalasar, and they camped there for a few days to recover. One night, Jon and Daenerys climbed a dune to survey the land. The sky was a canopy of stars, and the dragons flew overhead, silhouettes against the silver moon. Dany leaned her head against Jon's shoulder, exhaling softly. "I remember being so afraid back on Dragonstone," she said. "Every storm felt like it might tear the castle down. But now, I feel as though we are the storm, blowing across these lands." Jon gave a faint smile, threading his fingers through hers. "Maybe that's what we are meant to be," he said. "A force that cannot be ignored. But after all the blood and pain, do we truly want to be feared?" She considered the question, her breath warm against the desert chill. "I want to be just," she said at last. "I want to break the chains, not forge new ones. If that requires fear, so be it. But I hope there is room for mercy too." Jon nodded, feeling a swell of admiration for her. She was forging her own path, beyond the shadow of Viserys or the old Targaryen kings who had burned their enemies. They resumed their journey, pressing eastward, the small dragons ever growing, forging bonds with Daenerys and showing increasing interest in Jon. Rhaegal, named for the boy's father, would often perch near Jon, cocking his head as if studying him. When Jon tentatively offered a strip of dried meat, the dragon accepted and let out a satisfied chirp. Daenerys smiled at the sight. "He knows you share a blood tie," she teased softly. Jon's heart stirred with pride and unease. If the dragons recognized his Targaryen blood, it bound him even tighter to Daenerys's fate. At last, the Khalasar reached the ancient city known as Qarth. Its tall walls were carved with intricate images of trade caravans, dragons, and mysterious beasts. The city's gates opened to them cautiously. Inside, they found a realm of lavish palaces, cunning warlocks, wealthy merchants, and cunning political games that rivaled any in Westeros. Daenerys was hailed as the Mother of Dragons, attracting throngs of curious onlookers wherever she went. The city's great houses vied for her favor, hoping to see her dragons. She navigated the swirling intrigue, sometimes guided by Jon's advice, other times relying on her own instincts. The warlocks of Qarth invited them to the House of the Undying, promising knowledge and power. Jon urged caution, but Daenerys felt a compulsion to enter, to understand the visions that might shape her destiny. Within that eerie place, Daenerys experienced visions that rattled her core. She saw images of a blue rose growing from a chink in the wall of ice. She saw a wolf's head melded with a dragon's body. She heard whispers of the Song of Ice and Fire. When she emerged, shaken, Jon caught her before she collapsed. She clung to him, recounting fragments of what she had seen, including glimpses of a possible future where a great darkness threatened the realm. "It's not just about the throne," she murmured, trembling. "There's something else, a terror in the far north. I saw visions of ice and death, walking corpses and a long night." Jon felt an icy dread settle over him, recalling the half-remembered legends from his mother's homeland. Could it be that something monstrous stirred in the lands beyond the wall? The Qarthine elites, however, were more interested in displays of dragonfire than talk of undead armies in the north. They hosted sumptuous feasts, demanded Daenerys show off her dragons, and tried to maneuver her into alliances that promised little true aid. One evening, a masked warlock approached Jon in a shadowy courtyard, whispering cryptic things about the prophecy of the prince who was promised, about the union of ice and fire. When Jon pressed him for clarity, the warlock only said, "Remember your father's harp," then slipped away into the darkness, leaving Jon profoundly unsettled. Daenerys soon realized that Qarth offered no reliable path to Westeros. Too many factions vied for power, and their promises were empty. She confronted the city's so-called protectors, who refused to fund her conquest. Outraged, but determined, she chose to leave Qarth behind, to sail elsewhere in Essos where she could amass wealth and an army. Her dragons were still too small to conquer a kingdom, but they were a symbol that commanded attention. Jon supported her decision, convinced that stagnating in Qarth would only end in betrayal. So they boarded ships once more, the Dothraki uneasy at sea but trusting in their Khaleesi. Jon gazed back at the receding walls of Qarth, uncertain what the future held. He thought of Westeros, that distant homeland of half his blood. He thought of the dire wolves and winter snows, of King's Landing and the throne forged by the swords of Aegon's enemies. Above all, he remembered the vision Daenerys had shared, darkness rising in the north. It seemed there were greater battles to be fought than the clash of kings for a mere chair of swords. Yet forging alliances to face that threat would require strength and legitimacy. Daenerys, with dragons at her command, might unite the realm, if the realm could see beyond old grudges and the fear of Targaryens. And what of Jon's role in that? Was he truly the child of prophecy, or merely a piece on a board larger than he could fathom. Night fell over the deck of the ship. The dragons curled around Daenerys, restless and squabbling as the salt wind whipped their wings. Jon stood at the prow, staring out over the moonlit sea. A swirl of possibility and dread churned within him. He felt the pull of the north, the mysterious threat glimpsed in Daenerys' vision. He felt the fire of his Targaryen blood, awakened by the dragon's rebirth. And he remembered the old words, "The dragon has 3 heads." Daenerys joined him at the prow, the wind tugging at her silver-gold hair. She said nothing at first, slipping her arm through his. Below them, the water shimmered with the reflection of stars, as if the sky had draped itself upon the waves. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice hushed yet firm. "We have lost so much," she said, "and we stand to lose more if we fail. But I believe in the dragons, and I believe in us." Jon took her hand. "We will find a way," he said, though he did not know how. He felt the weight of countless generations pressing upon them, the tumultuous legacy of 2 great houses bound in his veins. He thought of Rhaegar Targaryen, who once believed that his children would save the world. He thought of Lyanna Stark, whose courage defied kings and lords alike. He wondered if they watched from beyond, if they saw him now, standing on the brink of a cataclysmic future. Daenerys lifted her face to the moonlight, her expression resolute. The dragons stirred at her feet, letting out low, rumbling calls that echoed across the water. Jon's heart beat in harmony with that sound, a mingling of ice and fire. Through triumph or tragedy, through war or peace, their journey was set upon a course that would shake the very foundations of the world. They stood there until the first hints of dawn lightened the sky. Then, with a final glance at each other, they turned toward the horizon, where Essos ended and the uncertain path to Westeros began. Neither knew what lay ahead: kings, wars, betrayals, the creeping terror of winter's return. But they carried within them a seed of hope, fueled by the stubborn conviction that the mistakes of the past need not define the future. Thus did Jon Snow, knowing at last the truth of his Targaryen blood, stand beside his sister in destiny, Daenerys Stormborn, as they set forth to challenge fate and carve a new song into the annals of the 7 kingdoms. A song of ice and fire, bound by family, tempered by love, and ignited by the untamed flames of reborn dragons.